Hey guys, so this week we're going to talk about something that I find extremely exciting and is very dear to my heart. We are going to talk about how our body essentially takes the food that we eat and transfers the energy in that food into little molecules so that our body can process a bunch of reactions using that energy. And the brunt of this lecture will be talking about the processes that happen in the mitochondria. And this is mitochondrial, right? And this is so dear to my heart because this is the research I did for about between 4 and 5 years in grad school. So I find it really exceptionally interesting. But I will be absolutely honest with you, it was not a topic I liked as an undergrad. I didn't like it much because I never really could grasp the understanding of what was happening. So I'm going to do the best that I can. If it seems a little confusing, don't feel bad about yourself or upset. A lot of this, in order to really understand what's going on, you have to understand a little bit of organic chemistry. And most of the people in the class have never even touched in a higher level chemistry class. So it can feel a little confusing, but the point of this is to explain it in a way that you can get just a little insight into it. So essentially what we're going to begin with talking, here is our outline. We're going to talk on the process of what's known as cellular respiration, which is how our body makes a brunt of the molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. That's the energy molecule in our cell. And basically what we do is we take bigger molecules like glucose and we cut that up into smaller molecules like ATP so our body can utilize it. And then good old fermentation, which is a process of making ATP without oxygen present. So we're going to do an overview of cellular respiration, and then we're going to talk about the four main parts: glycolysis, the breakdown of pyruvate, citric acid cycle, and what's essentially known as chemiosmosis or oxidative phosphorylation. And then we're just going to kind of bring these into play and talk about how different types of food molecules get broken down slightly differently. And then our last part is essentially fermentation. So the whole purpose about this unit is to talk about how our body makes the small energy molecule adenosine triphosphate. And we talked about adenosine triphosphate last week. Essentially, we talked about the cycling of it. Remember how we break it down to use a small part of the energy in the molecules for reactions, and then we basically build it back up again. Well, here, this section is going to talk about how we build it back up again. And adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is so important because it is the way our body is able to take energy and use it. So I like to think of glucose as being a $100 bill. And if you go to buy things, you'll realize that the $100 bill is not very efficient at that. Of course, it's a monetary value. It is a U.S. currency. It's completely legal, but if you go and try to buy a hamburger at Whataburger, or you try to go down here and in the college and use a $100 bill to essentially get a bag of chips, you're not going to be very successful because the monetary amount is just too much for most places to use. And so essentially what they do, or what you need to do with your $100 bill, is break it down into usable bills. So you go in and you go to the bank, and instead of having your $100 bill, you say, hey, can I get that $100 bill in 20s, 10s, 5s, and 1s? And they oblige you and go, okay. And then you're able to take those 20, 10s, 5s, and 1s and actually go out and use them. That's essentially what ATP is. ATP is like your 20, your 10, your 5, or your 1. Glucose is your $100 bill. Glucose has a ton of energy in it, but it's plainly too much energy and too big for your body to use it. And if your body used it for most reaction, you would be wasting a lot of money. It's like the idea of taking your $100 bill and putting it in the vending machine and the machine confusing it for $1. You would lose 99 bucks. And so you wouldn't want to do that in your everyday life. Your body doesn't want to lose energy in the terms of glucose by using it. It would rather kind of break it up into smaller parts. Now, for us to even talk about the story of energy or bodies using it, we have to ask ourselves, where does energy come from? So energy does flow into our ecosystem and out. And essentially, the energy that enters the ecosystem, what do you think it comes from? If you said light or the sun, you would be right. Essentially, that's how energy comes into our ecosystem and plants take it in. So essentially, plants take that energy and change it into chemical energy by making glucose. And that's what the process of photosynthesis is. Now, does anybody know, or can you think of how energy leaves the ecosystem? Or think about how energy leaves you. If you said heat, you would be correct. And of course, heat is not a very useful form of energy. So that's essentially how energy comes in to our ecosystem and how energy leaves it. And so this gives you a good idea about essentially how things work, right? So of course, we want energy to come in. So this light energy comes in, gets absorbed by the chloroplast. Specifically, there's chlorophyll, which is the pigment that's in those small organelles. And then they're going to take that energy and essentially make organic molecules, specifically sugar molecules. We always say glucose, but it's kind of a derivative of glucose that it makes. Now, they release oxygen because to them, oxygen is a waste molecule. And that gets put into the atmosphere and we take that up. Take up oxygen, right? And we use it in the process of making ATP in the mitochondria. And then essentially when this happens, you have a bunch of energy that's lost due to heat. Now, our waste molecules are essentially water and CO2. Carbon dioxide essentially is taken up by plants and it's used essentially to make sugars. So is water as well, but the carbon here actually gets put into the carbon of a sugar molecule. And so this is how it rotates. And this, when we talk about energy is neither created nor destroyed, just transferred, the first law of thermodynamics, this is a perfect example of how it is. It's never lost to anything. It just gets made from light energy to chemical energy, right? And then from chemical energy to heat energy. And so, or radiant energy. So this is essentially a perfect example of the first law of thermodynamics. Now, when we break down molecules, it's what's known as exergonic. Remember, in the G standing for energy. So this is an exit of energy, which means there's enough energy for it to happen, so the extra gets released, right? And so when we're talking about, when we essentially are talking about cellular respiration, this process is exergonic because essentially that should go there, right? The little dot. This, we are going to be breaking down, it's a catabolic reaction. We're going to be breaking down essentially sugar to yield a smaller molecule. And we do release some of it. So this part and fermentation are essentially exergonic reactions. Next week, when we get into photosynthesis, that's going to be an endergonic reaction because it's anabolic and we're building it. So aerobic respiration is specifically cellular respiration. In that, if you notice, we're going to have oxygen to make ATP. Fermentation also makes ATP, but it is a reaction that essentially occurs without without O2. Aerobic means with oxygen, and anaerobic means without oxygen, right? And I always remember this because when you do aerobic exercises, you essentially are running or doing step aerobics or any of those, you breathe a lot. So that should give you a good idea of essentially needing energy requires oxygen. And things like weight training, you're not necessarily breathing as much. That could be considered more of an anaerobic. So I always get students that complain a little bit about, oh my God, there's so much to remember when it comes to metabolism. And then I always show them this picture. You can't see it, but all the lines and different little dots you see, those are all molecules. So we're going to talk about some chemical reactions here, but it is nothing compared to what is really happening in our body. So as you go through, I'm always a person that if you tell me how bad it could be, then I'll appreciate how good it really is. So this is my way of saying it could be way worse, but enjoy this process because you're essentially learning how your body works. And when you learn how your body works, especially if you're into things like weight training or running or CrossFit or any of these other activities, it's kind of nice to understand how your body works so that you can always improve on it. So glucose metabolism, also known as cellular respiration, is the process of making ATP. And this is the overall reaction for it. You have C6H12O6, which is glucose. You should be able to tell that this is a carbohydrate because it has that ratio C1H2O1, right? And so this is glucose plus 6 oxygen plus 6 will go to, right? So these are the reactants. And these are the products, right? And so essentially what you're making is 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water, and then you're going to have plus energy because that's what you're making. You are going to be making ATP here, right? So to help, maybe if you know a little bit about theology, you'll notice that there's the number 666, right? Which if you think is the bad man. It looks kind of like a cat because I don't know how to draw. But the devil, and that's how I always remembered this because I essentially thought cellular respiration was straight from hell when I was an undergrad. I absolutely hated it. And I didn't purposely go into researching this. My the professor that essentially got me into his lab convinced me that I was going to be doing research in neurobiology, and then I come in and majority of my research is on mitochondria. I could have killed him at the time, but in retrospect, I'm extremely excited he made me do it because he made me find a love and passion for something that I absolutely detested at one point. And so, I mean, it's a nice feeling to be able to look fondly on something that you used to hate. And I think essentially I hated it because I never really understood its importance. I never really had any professor go, listen, this is how your body essentially makes the energy for you to run. This is how your body makes the energy for your heart to constantly beat. No one ever said that. They never actually put it in an application where I felt like it was kind of interesting. So I'm telling you, this is a process for which your entire body is functioning on. Without ATP, your body basically breaks down. You stop making ATP at the moment of death. And that's one of the big reasons why all your cells start dying. When you die, your cells are still alive, right? I mean, you have your heart has quit beating, essentially, and that is not going to be able, once your heart stops, it doesn't bring oxygen to the rest of your body. And, things slowly start shutting down. Or if you have some kind of pathology, essentially what's happening is you have a certain cells in the area that aren't working right. Now, once you die, your cells are alive for a bit after that. They start dying full body once they don't have oxygen to them for a certain amount of time. And the reason why oxygen is so important, because without oxygen, right, this should tell you right here, you can't make ATP. Without ATP, your cells cannot do a majority of the reactions in them, and without being able to do the reactions, they die. So there's 4 essential pathways that lead to this. Number 1 is glycolysis. The second is the breakdown of pyruvate. The third is the citric acid cycle, or the TCA cycle. This has a few names we'll do. And the last one is oxidative phosphorylation. We're going to be focusing on, in this first video, when we get into it, glycolysis, the breakdown of pyruvate, and the citric acid cycle. Now, this shows you a perfect example of why things are important, right? You run. So she's a runner. I love to run. I'm not an extremely fast runner, but I really, really enjoy it. So, and it releases all these natural endorphins and chemicals that if you can get through the initial run, afterwards you feel fantastic, right? And so you breathe in oxygen and it goes down your trachea into your lungs. At that point, there's these little capillaries, these little fine vessels all around your lungs, and the oxygen moves from inside the little air sacs of your lungs. It diffuses through those into capillaries. And the reason why the oxygen can diffuse or move from high to low is because essentially those layers only have about 1 cell thickness. They go into the capillaries, and from then on, they're in the bloodstream, right? They are going to move through. So essentially, your lungs are connected with this thing called the pulmonary circuit that goes to your heart. And so you have veins that come back to your heart, and then it's going to pump through the heart and then go out of your heart to the rest of your body, right? And once it goes out of your heart, it's going to go through arteries down to all your different tissues and organs. So essentially, oxygen is going to come over here to your muscles, and it's going to make the ATP, and ATP is required for muscle contraction. So essentially, then your muscles are going to contract, and in that process of making ATP, you make carbon dioxide. And then that's going to go up through your veins into your lungs, essentially diffuse, from the capillaries into the lungs, and then essentially to the pulmonary artery, or through the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, and go out your mouth, right? Some CO2 will actually go out of your skin too, and that's a big type of molecule that mosquitoes essentially can detect to come and bite you. So this is a whole process of how essentially oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged. And so essentially what's happening is this is a reaction again. So you have glucose here, right? Plus your 6 oxygen that will go to or make 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and this is an approximate, right? Anywhere from about normally between 32 to 36 ATPs are made, and it's just based on how efficient they are at the time, right? So we have different efficiencies when we go do things as well. So this is the reaction that you should know for cellular respiration. And when we come back, well, let me finish this. Now, the whole way that when we talk about this reaction here, essentially, to make ATP in this process, we are using reactions that move around electrons. There's that dreaded word again, right? Electrons. So we know electrons, especially valence electrons, are important in all kinds of reactions. That's what essentially makes bonds, right? So oxidation and reduction are chemical reactions that are very important in cellular respiration. And they're needed to release energy from molecules so that they can be converted into usable energy by the cell. So essentially, this process of oxidation reduction satisfies the law of conservation of energy. And how it does that is essentially it's just allowing electrons to move, which the electrons carry energy from one molecule to the next. So look at these two guys right here. And what do you notice about them? And you don't need to look at the 6. Just look at the molecules. So hopefully you noticed here you have a hydrogen and over here there's none, right? So essentially oxidation reactions are you get a loss of hydrogen, but specifically you lose electrons. And the electrons go with the hydrogen. So that's when an oxidation, so when you talk about metals and they rust, and you go, oh, the metal's been oxidized. Well, the reason why you see the change in color is because that metal has lost electrons. Essentially, most of the time when you have these reactions, the electrons go with the hydrogen or the hydrogen of the other molecule. And so this is what's considered oxidized, right? And oxygen likes to do that. Oxygen likes to take electrons and hydrogens from other things. So now that we know that oxygen likes to do that, let's notice this really quick. What do you notice between these guys? Hopefully you said over here, you notice that there's a hydrogen present. So essentially this oxygen here has been reduced, which means we have gained the hydrogen here or gained electrons, right? So the oxygen has gone through a reduction reaction. This glucose has gone through oxidation. So essentially what's happened is the oxygen has oxidized the sugar. And the way that I remember this is Leo says grr. Leo being loss of electrons, oxidation. Gain of electrons, reduction. Now, you might have heard something else too. There's a few of these that you can do. For instance, you might have also heard oil rig. Oxidation is loss. Reduction is gain. And you can do whichever one of these that you like. I always liked Leo. And if you notice, that's the lion that we have. His name is Leo. And he says grr, right? And you can see that. That's the reason why I kind of like this one here. And it tells you specifically what is gained and lost as in electrons. But if you're just trying to do it overall, then you can also use that in the sense of as long as you know oxidation is lost and reduction is gain. And so today when we talk about essentially the reactions that we are going to do, you're going to see here very easy the 4 reactions that we're going to have. So the first one we have here is glycolysis, right? And this you can see it happens in the cytoplasm. And there's a couple molecules you're going to make. You're going to make 2 NADHs, which you'll find out is an electron carrier. He's the guy that's going to carry electrons everywhere. And then you make 2 ATP, which is the energy guy, right? And so this is by what's known as direct synthesis, which means we make it directly. Now we start with glucose, and then we are going to have 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, otherwise known as pyruvate 2. It's the same molecule. And essentially here, you're going to find out we cut them in half. So this is the first one. Essentially this, you can't really see, is the second reaction. This is the breakdown of pyruvate. If you notice in this, there is no ATP. here. The only thing it makes is this 2 NADHs, which is the energy carrier. And if you know, from here on out, they're all made in the mitochondria. This third reaction is the citric acid cycle. At this point, you are making 2 electron carriers. You're making the NADH and FADH. These are both electron carriers. And of course, again, you only make 2 ATPs. And this is, once more, by direct synthesis, which means you are making it directly. It's not some side process that is. Now, if you notice here, change the colors really quick. You start with this glucose molecule. You see it moves, and the glucose molecule essentially goes from pyruvate and then goes to this thing called acetyl-CoA. So you're still using parts of that original glucose. And then that acetyl-CoA comes and feeds into the citric acid cycle. You're still using parts of that original glucose over here. But do you notice at this point you don't see any line continuing? Because this is where the total oxidation of glucose happens, which means we get all the electrons out of it we can, and it doesn't move on anymore. And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. And step 4 here is oxidative phosphorylation. And essentially, you're taking all of these guys and feeding them in here so you can take their electrons and their energy to essentially come down here and make ATP. But you don't do it directly. You use this enzyme called ATP synthase. And so you make anywhere from 32 to 34. Some of them even say 30, right? It's an approximation per glucose. So this is a lot. But do you notice that this one makes the most? And this is the part where you need oxygen. The rest of them, especially up here, not as important. You can have glucose happen without it. But here, the money shot right here, right? Everything that's going forward, the important stuff. This is essentially the what's most important. So once we get back in the next video or the next sequence, we're going to talk about glycolysis. Go ahead and take a moment break, and we will be back momentarily to talk about this.